So, hello everyone. This is a discussion of the chapter in the Critical Digital Literacies of Social Praxis book called, take a deep breath here, Utilizing Mobile Media and Games to Develop Critical Intercity Agents of Social Change by one Antero Garcia. And I thought this was a really great chapter. Lots of stuff we could unpack and play with here, and lots of good ideas. I think that Mr. Garcia here, he's a very creative guy, very innovative in his use of technology, and I think also seems to have a good understanding of what these ninth graders would consider to be fun, which is not something everybody has. So anyway, I think there's a lot we can learn from this chapter. So for the first part of this, I wanted to think a little bit about the setup that he had. He used iPods instead of the iPhones that I guess students might already have. And part of his rationale for this was that the iPod was a way around the question of having to pay a monthly bill, right, with an iPhone. I'm not sure how it would work giving all your students iPhones. But these iPods, the more I think about this, and these iPod touches, especially if you get one that's a little older than the current models, you can probably pick these up for $30, $40, maybe even cheaper than that for an older model. And there's actually quite a bit of power in these devices. The project that he has here, probably just a tenth of the stuff you could do with these things. You could, I guess, make full-on video, edited videos, and podcasts and all sorts of things. But anyways, I like this idea of the iPod because it's such a cheap technology now, but it's also very versatile, very powerful, very mobile. So anyway, I thought that's interesting. I'm actually thinking now about this. Maybe it would be a fun thing to do if you're on a budget. And then this use of the QR codes was pretty interesting as well. I'm not sure if you would be familiar with these things or not. They seemed like they were kind of a big deal for a while. Maybe when this was written, you would see these codes and advertisements on billboards and things. And you sometimes still see these. I've seen them at conferences before for sort of scavenger hunts like Garcia had put together here. But anyway, fairly easy technology to use. The applications are free, and it's easy to make these codes. Basically, people would use them to you would scan this code, and then it would send you to a website or a page on a website, and you could put whatever information you wanted to there. And then the last piece was this little spider god. Let's see, what was the name of him? His name, Anansi? Anansi. Ask Anansi, this apparently African character from African folklore. Which is, again, very playful, very interesting character to introduce into this activity. All right, so, and then just in case, well, I guess you already know the activity that he had engaged the students in, right? They would go around the campus with their iPods, take pictures, find these QR codes, kind of a scavenger hunt type thing. And the idea was that he chose his locations, the spaces where these codes were hidden very carefully. And he also thought about what he wanted the students to be thinking about as they were performing this scavenger hunt. Wanted them to be critically aware in ways that you probably wouldn't get to in a typical scavenger hunt, right? So it seems like from this reading, the students must have had some pretty shrewd students because he seemed to pick up pretty early on what he had in mind with this activity. But anyway, before we even get much further in, I just wanted to, before we even get into like the theory of this and all that, just what did you think about his scavenger hunt? Is this something that you think might be useful in your classes, or maybe something you would like to do as a student? Okay, so moving then into the why questions. Because you can imagine that even these iPods are fairly cheap, right? But I mean, there's still some cost to the school, to the district. So why bother with something like this? So he's got a couple or three reasons here. He says one that it's one thing to be sitting in a classroom lecturing or even having intense discussions about critical social issues, spatial analysis, all this kind of thing. You can sort of talk about it in a classroom all day long, and it's not really going to hit home in the same way that a student actually going to this location and sort of seeing, having that sort of aha, that sort of epiphany, like they did. The one that really stood out to me was when they found the QR code in that teacher's sort of mobile desk, this huge sort of contraption this guy was lugging around from class to class. And, you could talk about that in class. It's not going to have that same wake up call, I guess, as when the students were there and they saw this thing and they started asking themselves, why did the teacher put it here? Then I thought that was, even I kind of had an epiphany reading about it. So I can imagine how much more powerful it would be sending students around campus maybe to find locations where they might have these kinds of epiphanies. Just kind of a brilliant idea, really. But that's just one piece. He also talked about the role-playing aspect of this. So if you ever read James Paul G., he's got a book called What Video Games Have to Teach Us About Learning and Literacy. So really, G, he's the one that I associate with this idea, but it's very old, very well-studied, psychological, I guess, method of role-playing, not just for the role-playing games, but really you could role-play anything, right? But anyways, he had the students, he had a couple roles here, diplomat, engineer, checkered flag, tourist, and so on. And he said the reason that he did this was that helped help bridge that gap between the classroom and community, civic development. So, how to think about this. I guess, you sort of imagine it first, you sort of have a little role playing inside among the students. And then I guess the idea is that sort of inspires them or gives them the confidence to actually move away from role playing and actually having a real effect on the community. And we'll get more into that. I guess you could think about it too with the idea of a mock trial. That's kind of a role playing activity, but it also helps prepare you for the real trial, right? Or mock interview, same thing. Then this last thing here, this is the one that I was kind of most puzzled by or intrigued by. So he said this offline activity. So these iPods were not I guess they were not connected to Wi-Fi, maybe at least not connected to the LTE or whatever that network is, 3G, I guess. But he says a couple times, you really didn't even have to have those iPods. You could have done this without any kind of digital technology. Trying to figure out how that would work. But anyway, he says, any kind of activity like this is similar to the ones that do require the participatory media. And I guess the whole thing could be seen as a kind of going back to number 2, it's kind of a bridging activity. So anyway, I want to stop here again, see what do you make of this rationale? Do you agree with it, disagree with it, why or why not? Okay, then moving on, we get a little bit of his theoretical framework, right? He's got this great quotation from Darling and Hammond, or is it Darling Hammond? Not sure if that's one person or two. Anyway, research on teaching in urban schools suggests that teachers' limited skills and limiting beliefs about their students lead to a steady diet of low-level material coupled with unstimulating, rote-oriented teaching. So I've seen this criticism quite often. I call it the add technology and stir fallacy, right? The idea of, you need to improve your teaching, just get more devices in there, use more software, as if that alone is somehow going to help. And time and time again, if you look at the history of computers in education, I know some of you folks have researched into this area, may have had classes in it. There's a lot of really bad, quote unquote games. It's to the point where if you see the term educational game, or if you say that, the students will go, "Oh no," because they're so insipid, right? Solve the math problem or solve the spelling problem, and then you can play a little bit of a racing game, drive a car around for a couple of seconds, and then answer this question, and then drive the car around a little bit more. It's just very unimaginative applications for technology. And part of the problem is, like he said here, the teachers may not really be familiar with the technology. That's a problem. And also, I think really the second part of this idea about limiting beliefs about their students could be an even bigger problem. You know, imagining not knowing the students well enough to appreciate that they wouldn't find that sort of spelling game very fun. Uh, we're not teaching chimpanzees, right? These are uh, are equals in terms of intelligence, right? Going back to Ron Sears. So, okay, moving into this piece about critical pedagogy, and he cites a couple of different people here. Anyon, Duncan, Andrade, of course, the Freire comes up, Morel. So what is critical pedagogy? And there's, of course, a huge body of scholarship around this, but I think this first definition here gets at it pretty well. So a liberatory approach to education that guides students as co-constructors of knowledge to build their own meaning and critique of the inequities within their lives. So that, of course, Freire cited there, but I think Rancière, Jacotou, this to me sounds a whole lot like what they were trying to achieve as well, right? The idea of an intellectual emancipation, critical pedagogy seems to be in line with that same goal, right? I like the co-constructors of knowledge there. So seeing students, again, not just as, Freire used that banking model, so just kind of students as just receptacles versus kind of collaborators, right? So bringing the students up, bringing yourself down or whatever, and really approaching the inequities within, not only within that lesson, but within the whole intellectual enterprise. And then Anyon there is challenging the dominant narrative and the hidden curriculum of school. So I saw a couple people in their nuggets were intrigued by this idea about this hidden curriculum. Where to even begin with that idea? You could go back to Althusser, I suppose, and this idea of the school as one of these ideological state apparatuses. So what are students really learning in school? Are they learning to be part of a docile workforce, kind of yes people? Is that sort of thing being taught? And if so, what can you as an educator do about it? Can you challenge this and still keep your job, I guess, is the idea. We also learn about Homo Ludens. This is Huizinga, his book about, he talks about a lot of things beyond just the magic circle. If you read this book, and it's a pretty fun book to read, he goes into all of these different aspects of culture, talks about gameplay and gaming and like the legal context and the what else does he talk about there? I think there's a part about sports, of course, but several other aspects of our lives, and says, look, there's a distinctively game-like, play-like. There's always a play element in all these things, philosophy, whatever, and we tend to think about play and games as being not very serious activities at all, right? And, work and play are two very different things. And what this book says is that's really not a very productive way to look at it. In fact, you can learn a lot about pretty much any subject if you think about it in terms of a game. And of course, you can look at all these philosophers, Wittgenstein, for example, that talks about how important game. He talks about language is a game, for example, and how it's similar to other kinds of games. So anyway, one of the insights in this book is this idea of a magic circle. And you might have been able to figure it out from this reading, but I think it's worth thinking about it a little bit more. So when you play a game, you sort of enter into a different intellectual mindset, right? I think about this in terms of make-believe. So when as a little kid, you might have thought, well, let's just pretend that I'm a king, or I'm a knight, or, whatever you pretend to be, a horse, maybe a dog. And then your playmates they might come into the circle with you, right? And accept this sort of imaginary world. So that's kind of the play part of this. And then it would become a game if you started to put rules into it. So for example, the Dungeons and Dragons role play. So you're still playing, but there's kind of rules now. There's a way to fight an ogre, fight a dragon, whatever. There's a way to lose the game. And same thing with pretty much almost any game you can think of, right? I like this little diagram here. So the magic circle scoring a goal. If you're not part of that, coming out of that circle, then you just say, well, look, he just kicked the ball into the net. So I think that's kind of getting at this. And some people talk about a classroom as a magic circle. And kind of derisively sometimes they'll say, well, you got the ivory tower, but out there in the real world, yada, yada. Right. So even, some people kind of say that kind of in a dismissive fashion, but I guess you could look at it positively as well from this magic circle perspective and say, well, you start off playing, and that's a good way to learn about, this world beyond. It's not that I don't like the idea of college being a fake world, and then you got the real world. I kind of reject that sort of dichotomy, but nevertheless, I guess you could see some positive outcomes from that. We also get this IPT, informing, performing, and transforming as sort of stages of an activity. And Garcia talked about that in his project pretty well. I was thinking about this, what you could do in a composition classroom with this model. I guess to some extent, this is pretty much exactly what we would hope for. You have students do some research on the topic, right? Then they write an essay on the topic. Maybe not getting to that third stage enough, that transform. We like to think that in the course of the research and in course of the writing and thinking about the issue, that it does kind of have a transformative effect on the student. Maybe they came in with a very naive view, very closed-minded view, what we might call a received view, not even really their perspective, right? Just what they've sort of been handed. And then transforming the way they think about that and maybe even transforming their own lives. But I think what this author wants to say is we need to go beyond that even. It needs to have, there's a quotation there, right? Challenge the hegemonic norms of their surroundings. So this has really got me to thinking, what could we do to hit that third stage in our classes? So maybe I'll just stop here. And I just want you to think for a minute about the classes you're teaching or the ones you're taking. And have you hit this third stage? And if so, could you talk a little bit about that? And if not, maybe what are your ideas as to how you might get there? Okay, then we have some pretty juicy quotations about critical transformations. He says there on 121, I pointed out to the class parallels between gameplay and school structures, and that fair gameplay and equitable gameplay essentially establish similar patterns of inequality. So this, I got kind of led into a rabbit hole on this. I read all these articles about, what's the difference between fair and equal? And it's a pretty interesting, there's a lot of political dimensions to something like that, right? But, you can treat students equally or be equitable, but that in some ways might not be fair to them. What was some of the examples I looked at was there was a story about a mom who tried to treat all her kids equally, notwithstanding the fact that one of her kids had some pretty severe illnesses and actually was dying and died at a very young age. And so she was kind of torn up about this because even though she treated all the kids equally, maybe it was unfair not to give the kid with these all these problems more attention, more nurturing than the other ones, and so on. So that was like a very poignant example of this. But I could see this. This one makes a lot of sense to me. This first thing that he did, to try to help the students develop some critical awareness, because the way that he structured the game, right? The students were complaining a little bit. Well, that's not fair. Some of these kids, some of these guys worked in groups, right? And they got to the answers. How is that fair? So just having that sort of whoa moment was a good segue, I guess, and say, well, okay, now that as long as we're talking about fairness in this game, why don't we think, about fairness in society, I suppose. So then he says, pedagogically, this exercise places the critical practices of understanding hidden narratives of power within the community as a component of transformative, empowering voice. And then talked about how you can expand beyond reading the word, reading the world, and moved from that into actually writing the world. And quite literally, he had the students take their projects and put them in these locations where they'd found the code, right? So I think there was one on a water fountain. Um, so I thought that was, again, pretty interesting idea. The other students, obviously, once the students had basically published these things, right? They're not just their classmates, but any of the other students, I suppose, the other teachers, maybe even if the parents came to the school, they would see these things, and that was a way to get their voices out there. Not just speaking to each other, speaking to the teacher, but actually, quite possibly make a real difference in their community. So I thought that was really, really nice and powerful. But what do you think? What are you thinking at this point? Did you like his? You sort of like the direction that he was going? If so, again, I always like to know what sort of ideas have occurred to you reading this. Maybe you want to use iPods in one of your classes, or you got something else you're thinking of? He did eventually have his students edit a Wikipedia page about their school. And of course, St. Cloud State University, we've got a Wikipedia page as well. So maybe you could have a writing project that just like his kind of built up to that. But anyway, lots of material here. So again, just let me know your thoughts. If there's any points you wanted me to think about or talk about I didn't get to, just mention those. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed this, and see you next time.